Operation Warp Speed, the new Manhattan Project that wasn't. In this video, I will discuss how inflated expectations from the wartime Manhattan Project, which developed atomic bombs, isolated the element plutonium used in many bombs, and built the first nuclear reactors, probably had many other great successes in a very short time period, and seemingly was able to develop bombs which worked right the first time in the Trinity test and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Manhattan Project was unusually successful, as I will discuss, and is often invoked in big science projects since World War II to justify them and to explicitly or implicitly make very grandiose promises about the likely results of those programs. New Manhattan projects usually fail and appear to have a failure rate at least 80 to 90%. Operation Warp Speed was the ultra-fast program to develop an effective vaccine against COVID-19. It was heavily hyped, as most viewers probably are well aware, with it either being implied or claimed that these vaccines would eliminate the virus, make people unable to catch it, not get sick, all that kind of thing. The results have at best been very disappointing. The virus appears to have rapidly mutated around the vaccine, with the Omicron outbreaks happening all over the world now, with huge numbers of vaccinated people getting sick regularly and some dying. The powers that be have tried to put a very positive spin on that, but it's obviously a very disappointing result and not what was implied or explicitly promised by public health authorities, scientists, giant pharmaceutical companies, and others for almost 2 years. And understand, we shut down the global economy in March of 2020 for essentially years, with a few exceptions like Sweden, devastating the economy. All of this on the unreasonable, unrealistic, and historically contradicted belief that one could develop a vaccine at speeds never seen before and be spectacularly successful like the Manhattan Project was. The Manhattan Project took from 1939 to the Trinity test in July of 1945, 6 full years. Here, we're talking about 2 years or less. Actually, the vaccines were being pumped into people in the end of 2020, 7-8 months. Did not work very well at best. There is, of course, growing evidence of various problems with those vaccines. I'm not going to get into that here. In this video, I want to make clear what the Manhattan Project did, why people have unrealistic expectations about it, and very importantly, the historical experience with many new Manhattan projects since World War II is they usually fail to produce real practical results, or the results are very negligible, especially considering the cost of these enormous programs. Well, let's set the context a little bit. Big science programs, large funded programs with tens of thousands of people run on a quasi-military basis by a general, Leslie Groves, huge government operations like this were almost unprecedented in World War II. There are few historical examples. Science and engineering was generally small scale up until World War II. A few people, a small team, even the big science pre-World War II was often very small scale. For example, Robert Goddard's rocket team in New Mexico, which developed some of the early rockets, handful of people. He had a team of about 6 or 7 people. That's just one example. And that was a big science project with heavy funding from the Guggenheims and other people. So it was very unusual. And it was spectacularly successful, remarkably successful. And it led to the expectation that, well, if we apply this new model with huge funding, huge armies of people, a quasi-military structure, a hierarchy, all of this kind of stuff, not some, kook in his mom's garage, not that kind of science, not the small science that had been the norm most of the time historically. There are some examples of big science projects prior to World War II, even prior to World War I. This could be a reproducible formula, modern management, all that kind of stuff, and it would produce spectacular progress like we've never seen before. That failed. Okay, most new Manhattan projects, like the war on cancer, have produced negligible, disappointing results in practical real-world terms. They produce thousands of papers. They produce theoretical breakthroughs. The Nobel Prize was awarded for the molecular basis of cancer in the 1970s. As most viewers, I'm sure, have personally experienced, people continue not only to get cancer, but to die from it. It's one of the leading causes of death. The results have been very, very disappointing, despite $200 billion, an annual budget to this day larger than the Manhattan Project had. But the results have been very disappointing. The Human Genome Project, very heavily hyped 10 years ago. Francis Collins, the recently retired director of the National Institutes of Health, usually credited as leading that program, produced virtually nothing of any practical significance, certainly not a cure for cancer or even a dramatically better treatment. Again, theoretical breakthroughs, we know more about genes, we know more about the structure of the human DNA, but we don't have something very useful. That has been the norm. I want to speak from personal experience with this. I've experienced this up close and personal in physics. Physics is where the Manhattan Project came from. They kept trying to do it. Controlled nuclear fusion, total failure after 70 years. Particle physics, the field that I was in, very little in the way of true practical results from that field, despite billions and billions of dollars spent since the 1950s. I saw this up close and personal. There's big talk, there's lots of money, there's hierarchy, there's bureaucracy, there's all of this stuff, but the practical results are missing. The physicists themselves in programs like controlled fusion, like tokamaks, inertial confinement fusion, all this kind of stuff, particle physics, were unable to reproduce their spectacular success from the 1940s and 50s with the atomic bombs and the development of the hydrogen bomb. Progress in these fields, it topped out, okay, it stagnated. But it's important to understand, this has over and over been the experience with new Manhattan projects. They mostly fail. And senior scientists and people, they know this, okay? They will say this in certain contexts. Venture capitalists, which is more development than our research alone, but it's more development focused, even in biotechnology where there's real research done with venture capital funding. Venture capitalists in certain contexts will say, oh, we have an 80 to 90% failure rate. Scientists, when they're confronted about failures, about cases like Operation Warp Speed, where they overpromised and they way underdelivered, where they made big promises and they very possibly invoked the image of the Manhattan Project. They'll say, oh, there's an 80 to 90% failure rate. It actually may be much worse in some fields. It may be essentially 100%. That's maybe for future videos. Let me, in fact, I want to back up my statement that the Manhattan Project was invoked, that people were thinking about that with this book. This is In Trump Time by Peter Navarro. It's a key President Trump advisor, very central figure in pushing the panic button, backing the lockdowns in March of 2020, all this kind of reaction. Definitely Mr. Warp Speed, okay? And he speaks glowingly about the program, as other Trump folks like Scott Atlas do. Okay, so this is very much a program of President Trump and his minions. Okay, so let me read briefly from the 5th chapter. Okay, this is page 63, chapter 5 of his book, and the title is An Unlost February and Off to the Vaccine Horse Race. Okay, and he has an opening quote from one of his journals. This is Peter Navarro journal entry, February 9th, 2020. So this is about a month before the lockdowns. And here we go. I'm just going to quote one sentence because it's a long thing. He's talking in this memo about what the government should do. Many of these policies were actually adopted and embraced by everybody. And I mean everybody, like the people who denounced President Trump actually have proceeded to follow this fiasco fanatically, curiously enough. Okay. And jumpstart vaccine development in a Manhattan Project style approach, citing the Manhattan Project. This is very, very common. Very likely he believed this. He didn't, even though he's an economist, he didn't really look at the history of these programs, I would say, and realize that they mostly fail miserably. So just to remind you, this is from an official book by one of the key people behind the lockdowns, Operation Warp Speed. Okay, so I'm not quoting a secondary source here. This is a primary source. So they were thinking in terms of the Manhattan Project and a distorted impression of the reproducibility of the spectacular success of the Manhattan Project. Well, the Manhattan Project was very unusual in what it achieved in such a short period of time. And it was also followed up by the successful development of the hydrogen bomb, the thermonuclear bomb, which is 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, has never been used in war. One hydrogen bomb could cause way more destruction than what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Could obliterate New York City, for example, and its suburbs, everything. Okay. These were spectacular successes, really unprecedented probably in the history of science and technology, certainly one of the greatest successes, terribly destructive weapons. Problem, as I said, and specifically this happened in physics, the people who cut their teeth, the people who learned what they learned on the Manhattan Project went on, they got tons of money, huge programs, things like controlled fusion that failed. Programs like particle physics, which have been going on for hundreds of years and have theoretical breakthroughs like the Standard Model or finding the Higgs particle, but have not produced new energy sources, have not produced, in fact, more powerful weapons as far as we can tell, actually haven't accomplished that much. They weren't able to reproduce this spectacular success. And that's the physicists. Now, there have been many other programs, specifically in medicine, like the war on cancer, $200 billion, way more money than the Manhattan Project ever got. The National Genome Project also didn't produce anything of great practical significance whatsoever, or even minimal, right? I mean, where are the cures for cancer? Where is all this stuff? Didn't happen. So this isn't unusual. New Manhattan projects usually fail to produce much, if anything, in practical results. I'm not saying they never work. I'm sure some of you viewers know of cases where they appear to have actually produced dramatic successes, but the odds of success are clearly very poor. And the 80 to 90% number is kind of folklore, but it matches up with actual experience, my own. It matches up with just reading through them and realizing, oh, this one failed and that one failed and this one failed in practical terms. And I do think it's important to focus on practical terms because research projects today produce papers, peer-reviewed papers, often in prominent journals. The one I worked on that flopped has several publications. You can find them on my website, so on. But in real practical terms, nothing came out of it. And it went way over budget. It was a fiasco. It was very disappointing to be involved in, but this is not that unusual. It's actually the norm with these things. What happened with Operation Warp Speed, where now everybody's getting sick, even though they're vaccinated, the vaccines don't work very well. There's lots of reason to think they may actually be, it may be much worse than that. Consider the loss of face to virtually everybody. Bill Gates, Trump, I mean, everybody bought into this, all huge fraction of our society and powerful people, corporate heads, politicians in both political parties in the US, people across the supposed political spectrum from the right to the left, people bought into this. And if you think they didn't, if you've got some weird idea that, well, it was all the Democrats, it was all, the left, for example, and that can be positive or negative, think about Peter Navarro and this book, just in case you need some evidence. Now, if you see Operation Warp Speed as somehow this great success, which it obviously wasn't, then you think Trump's a great guy, right? If you think it was a dismal flop, well, okay, the Democrats totally bought into it. They started trying to compel people to take these experimental vaccines. Think about that. Produced by this guy, by these people that they denounce as the worst people in the world, right? But they decided to take this program, given the history that they should know of the frequent and 80 to 90% failure rate in practical terms of R&D. They embraced all of this. They didn't raise any questions, especially after the election, about this, okay? So that's my point. So what lessons should we derive away from this? Personally, individually, in your own life, like whether or not, to take the vaccines, for example, and collectively as not just the US, but the entire global society. It's very simple. We now know from 70 plus years of experience that most new Manhattan projects, and they're often billed as a new Manhattan project, you can Google that term, new Manhattan project, and you'll find all sorts of fiascos, okay? They mostly fail in practical terms. That's not unusual. It's what we've seen. It's what happened in physics. It's what happens. Doesn't mean they always fail. It doesn't mean they shouldn't always sometimes be funded, but they should be funded with the understanding that they will likely fail. In the case of what's happened over the last 2 years with the COVID pandemic, we shut down the global economy in almost every nation except maybe Sweden and a couple of others, right? We shut everything down, locked everybody up, went nuts, screamed at each other. People clung to this fantasy that an R&D program could produce a really good vaccine in months. I mean, this guy was talking about months. They were injecting people with a largely untested product in December of 2020. All right, that hasn't worked out very well. That's not surprising. It's to be expected. Okay, we might have lucked out, but closing down the global economy or other drastic actions in your personal life or collectively based on this inflated idea that we can reliably reproduce the Manhattan Project, that kind of level of success. So this is like 99.9% certain it's going to work, or even 99%. very high percentage. It's exactly the opposite of what we really know from 70 years of experience. We know that new Manhattan projects have a very high failure rate. Probably at least 80 to 90% of them fail in practical terms. That is borne out by experience throughout the world in many different fields, and in physics by the people who took the ideas for the Manhattan Project and tried to reproduce them over the last 70 years. And the field has stagnated, as I can say from personal experience. It hasn't produced energy too cheap to meter as they were promising in the 50s, or many other things. They're lost in theoretical breakthroughs like superstrings, which have become almost a laughingstock, actually. So the point is, don't plan on this. It's very, very high risk, whether it's an investment decision to invest in a company like Theranos, for example, a few years ago. The risk level is extremely high. It's 80 to 90% or bigger in many cases. That may even sort of understate the problem, because many breakthroughs look like there's some key development or key insight that's needed, and until someone has that, everything fails. That's what you often see. So calling that 80 to 90% is misleading, because there's a big time evolution. It's not 80 to 90% all the time. It's technology progresses, knowledge progresses, some weird thing happens, and suddenly something becomes feasible that just was not feasible in the past. So again, the failure rate is very high. The second lesson is to think about all these people 2 years ago who either convinced themselves irrationally, perhaps this, or were misleading or lying to people about the likelihood of success, shutting down the global economy, sabotaging the local economy, leading to all these supply chain disruptions. All kinds of problems are totally predictable if you shut the world economy down. To do that for something with a 99.9% likelihood of success, which is how they talked about this, is one thing and maybe makes sense. But they're talking about new Manhattan projects, about vaccine development, about fields which have, in practical, real world terms, actual cures for diseases, actual effective treatments, things like the atomic bomb or fusion power, for example, or cures for cancer. They have a very, very high failure rate, probably easily above 80%. So it was a mistake for people individually and collectively, and leaders, to act as if the Manhattan Project is this reproducible formula. We can solve this problem by throwing a lot of money at it, people, all that kind of stuff. It's not the way to think. When you hear new Manhattan Project or language, people invoking the Manhattan Project, like Peter Navarro, you should think extremely high risk, very likely to fail. Plan accordingly. There's a huge difference in what you do in that situation, and we didn't follow that. So that is my conclusion for this video. Operation Warp Speed, the new Manhattan Project that was not.
This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email and on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising beholden, big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical software is developing algorithms and software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and increasing the predictive power of the results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page, https://www.patreon.com/mathsoft, or scanning the QR code in the lower right corner.